All right, so just to get an idea of who's in the room, basically, who has worked with React before, just so I can get an idea. Awesome, so pretty much everybody. That's great. So yeah, today this is part 2 of part 3. Last week, if you missed it, I have to remember doing both screens. Last week, if you missed it, we had an introduction into React JavaScript, so you kind of touched base on the what is React JavaScript all about, how is it different, how does it work, covered components, containers, pages, structure. We covered a little bit of Webpack and Redux, kind of surfaced that, what the context API is. We talked about create React app and went through that. And so today we're going to talk about the changes in React 16, and the reason for that is there just have been so many major changes. None of them are really, you have to like learn a lot of new stuff and you have to rewrite your old code. It's more like additions to the functionality, which is really cool. So you probably have to refactor some code because it's now 10 times easier than before. And so we're just going to cover those. I'm really excited for this because yesterday they dropped version 16.6 and I made the presentation this morning. So I actually covered everything that got released yesterday. Gave me a chance to kind of dive into the changes as well. So I'm going to cover those as well. So if we look at the roadmap, you will see that. So first of all, my name is JP Wallhorn. JP stands for Jan Philipp. As you can see the German flag, I'm from Germany originally, moved to the US roughly 6 years ago. So I'm originally in Germany, went out to college there, got my bachelor degree out there, and then kind of went here for work. Found work here, found my wife, she's here today as well. So that's kind of like how it all started. So these slides will be available shortly after this talk, same as last time. I'll tweet them out. I can give you guys my link later. I'm going to post it on Discord. We're basically going to distribute it everywhere we can, and then so you have the slides available, and it's basically just a GitHub page you can access, and then the video will be available later on as well. So I have my own company. It's called Syntx, and we do web development, mobile app development. We do marketing, digital marketing. Why is this not working? Oh, the page is not working. Well, hopefully it's only the only page. Let's see. All right. Otherwise, we're gonna have a problem. So I have my own company. We do a lot of app development, everything in the React world, and we do Salesforce as well. Since I created my own business, which was roughly half a year ago, I had the pleasure to work with companies like Blue Bottle Coffee. We just signed the US government, mobile apps in the back end. So we did some Node.js with Postgres there. Really fun projects, built a ReactJS framework for Blue Bottle, and so it's been really fun. Before that, I actually worked across the street here at ServiceLink Auction in the AIG building. I was the engineering director over there, so I had a team of roughly 6-7 people there. And we had one of the best projects there was probably just to implement a brand new React e-commerce shop. So whoever doesn't know the company, it's a real estate auction company. So they sell foreclosed assets for the banks online. And so we built a whole store where you can do your auctioning events. Basically, you can bid on it, you can buy the properties and all that in React. Had a big focus on SEO as well, of course, to drive organic traffic. And that was a really cool project. We built it up from the ground up, which was awesome. So let's talk about changes in React.js 16. Just warning, these are not all the changes. Those are just some highlights. Some of the things I think are the major ones. And then check out their blog for the full changelog, reactjs.com, I believe. And they have a full changelog there where you can access everything that has been changing over the last couple of months. So this is the roadmap for today. We're going to talk about the context API, which has been huge over the last couple of months. We're going to talk about fragments. We're going to talk about error boundaries, how we handle errors in version 16, about portals. And then the last 3 things is memo, lazy, and context type, and all of these things came out yesterday. So I'm really excited to talk about those things. I'm not sure if you've heard about it yet, so I'm really excited about those 3 parts at the end. So if you guys are ready, we can kick it off. Let's see. Let's start with the context API. So what is the context API? It's not there to replace Redux. First of all, I'm going to take this away. Everybody thinks, oh, I can get Redux. I can get rid of Redux. No, it's not that easy. It's not as fully functional. But basically, what it does, you can share data between components now. So basically, before you had to pass the data between components via the props, so you had to manually pass the data through. If you had in your React tree 6, 7 levels, you had to literally drill down on each level and pass the data manually from top to bottom, basically. So now with the context API, you can share the data without passing it manually through. So what does that mean? It's basically a global object in your React application that you can access. And it's basically everything that's below the tree, below the level can be accessed. And it's kind of like a global object that you can access throughout the project, I guess. And so why do we need this? Obviously we want to avoid props drilling. So sometimes just because you have props drilling doesn't mean it's necessarily because you had to. Sometimes they could also be wrong architecture, where you just have like too many levels and you should maybe like revisit how you structured the application in the React tree. But a lot of times you have multiple levels, like maybe 4 levels of components, and instead of passing it from the first to the very last one, you can just now pass it. You can basically capture it in the first one and then consume it in the very last one because you maybe don't need it in the middle, basically. So if we look at a music player example, it becomes very obvious. So we got the root over here, which is our iOS tree component. We got our header, and then we got our player container. So the header root will be over here, which is kind of like the red stuff. The player container, which is down here. Then we got the element title, we got button containers, and then within the button containers, we got 3 components for back, play, and next song, basically. So if you think about it, if you have information down here on the root, where you maybe capture like via the API all the information, or in a container, you now have to pass through to the next button, whatever the next song is, so you can basically go to the next song, to the previous one. So you would have to manually drill that through from top to bottom. Or you said that normally you would pass props to each of the components, basically, and that can become painful. You can make mistakes. If you forget it in one level, you're going to mess up the rest of it. And so that's where the context API comes in really handy. And I'm going to tell you guys how this works. Instead of passing it through what we just talked about, from the root app to the header and the body and to the previous and play button, we kind of talked about, I guess, as a global object. So it's kind of like something that sits on the outside and makes it available to every component in your React application. So no matter where you are now in this tree, you can access and consume the data, basically. And that's fantastic, but how do we implement this? Is the implementation complicated? Is it as painful as Redux to implement? And just to give you a good heads up, it's actually really easy to implement. It's a couple lines of code, so we're going to go through that as well. You will need actually 3 things. It's divided by context, provider, and consumer. The context sits on the top, the provider one level below that, and the consumer is everything that needs access to the data, basically. Let's talk about the context first. So if we look at, I'm glad the pictures are working. So if we look at the context, line 18, I can hopefully make this a little bit bigger. Give me like 1 second. There we go. So if we look at this, line 18 basically defines the context. So it says const theme context, React, create context, and then we pass through the theme config to light. Light is here defined. We got a header, background, font, color, body, background, and the logo, basically. So now I've created my context, and we're now going to go into the next steps on how we can access this data in which we store the light theme, basically. Let's go back. Okay. All right. So we can also do multiple contexts. So you don't have to have just one context where you have to fit everything in. You can create multiple contexts, just name them appropriately, and then you can access them throughout the application as well. So let's say you have a theme and you have multi-language. You don't have to put it all in one container. You can have it in multiple contexts, basically. So the provider is the next step, and that one, the only rule is basically needs to be higher in the tree than the consumers, basically. So you can't have the provider in the very bottom and then access stuff on the very top of it. That still doesn't work. It's still kind of like a waterfall where you have to define the provider up top, and then everything that's below the provider in the tree can then access and be a consumer, basically. So if we look at this, I'm going to make this a little bit bigger again. There we go. So right here is a new component, basically. And right here we are defining, we're wrapping basically the HTML code or the JSX code, we're wrapping it into a provider. So down here in line 20 we can see theme context, which is the context that we defined earlier. Oh, a little bit larger, sorry. Let me go down and see if I can. There we go. Is it big enough? Sorry. Okay, cool. So the theme context dot provider, and then again, when you have multiple contexts, you can basically access different contexts here now. So if you have like language context, and then we pass the value, which is the theme config, and then in this case, we're going to pass the value this.state.theme. This.state.theme is currently defined as light, basically. So that's my provider. And then I have some other stuff here. I have my little header component, which has a toggle, and in that toggle I can definitely pass my values, and then I can switch between light and dark, for example. So let's go to the last level, consumer. The only requirement is it needs to return a function as a child that returns JSX, and how that looks like I can show you. And I should probably not forget you want to import the context into the consumer file, otherwise it doesn't work. So we're going to look into this. So as you can see, I'm importing the theme context from wherever I defined my context, basically. And then you can see same syntax, basically. Theme context, again, I'm defining which context I'm accessing, dot consumer, and then now I'm passing a function, basically, where I'm passing a theme, and then within my HTML code or JSX code, when I pass in my style, I can now access my theme properties, basically. So I have theme.font color, I have theme.body background, basically. And so now I can access those information via this variable that I'm passing right here. And boom, I have it available. I don't have to like prop scroll it down. I can literally just access it easy like this. I don't have to access the whole object. I have everything available, but I don't have to use everything in this context, basically. So now that I have a consumer, this could be, root could be the provider, and then down here at the very bottom, my next button, this is where I can access, for example, like the next song, for example. And so now I don't have to prop scroll it down. I can easily consume it. Similar to how Redux works, same thing basically, where you can connect your component or your class basically, and then from there you can connect whatever information you have in Redux in your store, and you can access that then via props in your component that you have. So pretty similar. One more step with the provider, but other than that, it's a little bit similar, I would say. Any questions in regards to that? Yes.
I have one. If I have other functions in my component, can I wrap that theme context.consumer above so that all of my functions are in there and I can access
you can
context from my functions?
The thing is it needs to return JSX.
Okay.
So wherever you call this, basically, it needs to return JSX code. So if it doesn't, as long as it returns JSX code, you're fine, basically. So it's really meant for components, basically, and that's where also differences come in Redux, because in Redux you can use it anywhere you want. You can just consume the data, manipulate it, do some other API calls based on it, and that's exactly one of the differences. So good question, where the context API is very different from Redux, and why we can't just replace it right away. All right. Next slide. So all in one. Now we saw everything separated. We saw the context, we saw the provider, we saw the consumer. So this is an example from React.js directly, where everything is in one file, basically. Doesn't make sense really in practical terms, but it makes it visually really easy. That's too much struggling over here. There we go. There we go. So I'm creating my context first. Create context light. My light is defined right here, basically. Now I'm rendering my function. I define my provider with this state.theme, which is light again. And then now I can return the sub-house.children, for example. Then in my other class, which is my theme button in this case, I can now just access the theme context with the consumer. I got my anonymous function over here again with my theme, and then I can return, the button can then access whatever is in the theme, basically defined. So this is in one file. You will probably never have this, because why use context API in one file? But it makes it visually very easy on how the structure works, basically. All right, and that's it. And again, should you implement it right away for everything? No, again, we just talked about like a use case where it doesn't make sense. So you don't have to implement it everywhere. You know, if you have already a full project where you maybe go down 2 levels with your props, probably just leave it. I mean, like, you probably have other things to do than refactoring your code from props to context API. But if you have like 6 levels going down and you don't, you always, there's always this one variable that you mess up and you forget, then it probably makes sense to create that context API. And again, no, don't refactor all your code. Alright, so it's basically good for medium-sized applications, basically. That's what we normally recommend it for. If it's large application, it becomes easily you can forget about it, basically, since it's so large. So we recommend it normally for medium-sized applications. But I mean, if you have a larger application, you find use case for it, why not? Good use cases are, again, multi-theme projects, multi-language projects. So if you have a whole catalog of, let's say, the button names and the menu names, you have them defined in different languages. So now you can just always, if the language is English, then you automatically can pass through the value of the English name of the button. When it's, let's say, French, for example, you can then pass in the French name. And it's very easy to access that. And the settings are available for the whole project. So you don't have to go back and do the prop sterling everywhere to just make sure you show the right language and don't forget anything. And you are creating outside dependencies with this, so just to make sure you keep that in mind. So the moment you have a consumer or you have a provider, the consumer is dependent on the provider, on the context, basically. So now you're creating dependencies that are outside of the component, basically. So if something is wrong with that, if, for example, it can't render, it crashes, then you have the problem trickles down, basically. And so you're creating outside dependencies with this, so there's something to keep in mind. Alright, let's talk about fragments. It's not a big topic, but it's really cool. I like it. So basically, if we have a simple component, the problem it's not really a problem, it's more like a style problem. The problem is not straightforward. So if we look at this, for example, this is like a very simple component. I have my dumb component over here, which is my paragraph. Then I'm returning like a P, basically a paragraph. That says edit, and then my app.js and save to reload, basically. So this is really extracted from kind of like a React app. So this is easy, this is fine, this works, everything is cool. But what if we want to pass multiple things, so multiple elements from a component? You might think, oh, I'm just going to add another p tag and let's make it crash, and all of a sudden when you go to the next screen to look at the browser, failed to compile. So now, boom, the whole thing crashed. You're like, what happened? I just added like another p tag, like what's going on? And if we look at it, you basically have to wrap it in a div. So whenever we have a return from a component, it needs to be returned in one div element, basically. So what you have to do is you have to wrap those two p tags in a div element, and now all of a sudden it works again. So that's why you always have that div element in your return functions, because everything in between, if you have multiple elements, needs returned as one element. So there's always one element that's getting returned by default, so you can't just all of a sudden return multiple elements. That's not how they build it. So you have to make sure you return one element. Well, div, you have div everywhere, everything has to be wrapped in a div, right? That can cause obviously problems, and it's not ideal really, at least I'm not a big fan of using too many divs. And so they introduced Fragments. So welcome to Fragments. So you probably have a guess what it does. But let's look at this. Instead of using a div, we can literally now use empty brackets, basically. In there could be fragment, and you can do import fragment from React, basically, and then you can just write in fragment there. But that was in the beginning, whereas version 16 when they came out of it. Version 16.2, which got released a couple of weeks after, they basically removed that necessity from writing fragment every single time, because they're like, it's almost like div. So you can literally have empty brackets right here, or however you want to call them, I don't even know. So you wrap the p tags in those empty things over here. They don't have any meaning other than you're returning one element, basically, which is a fragment, and React won't crash. So now you're saving your divs, basically, and you can just wrap it in a fragment. So that's really what fragment is all about. And I tried using emojis for this, but it doesn't really work, so save the time for that. Because you can technically do import fragment as ghost emoji, rocket emoji. It doesn't really work, it doesn't like it. That's Fragments. It was really quick, small addition, but I like it. So now we're going to go over to arrow boundaries, and that's one of my favorite topics actually as well in the React 16 changes. So previously, runtime errors during rendering broke your app. So you had to refresh your whole screen. nothing worked. If you had an uncaught error in production, your user was basically hopeless because they had to like refresh their screen, but who thinks about refreshing their screen when something is broken? So you get to refresh the whole application, and by default now, React 16 will just unmount the tree and doesn't display the code. So what that means is, again, imagine a tree that has multiple elements. Left side works, right side doesn't. So now it will just unmount the right side, and there's going to be an empty block of code. And then the left side is still going to be displayed. So like imagine you split your screen in two halves. This one breaks, this one works. You will see basically a split screen of only half of the application working. But at least your application is still working, so it doesn't crash anymore. You have to refresh the screen. You can still work with half of the screen at least. And if you have smaller components, obviously that component will be unmounted. It's not ideal, but it's better. But they did something more and something better to even catch that. And they introduced a new lifecycle method to the famous React lifecycle, which we talked about in the introduction in React.js last time. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the React lifecycle basically. So they made some changes to it in React 16. They got rid of a bunch of methods. For example, component will mount is gone, component will receive props is gone. So those are going to be, you already get warnings, and in React 17 they're going to be fully gone basically. Unless you do the unsafe method, I believe. So new lifecycle method, it's kind of like a try catch in Node.js where you can try something and catch the error. And what in the component the lifecycle is called component did catch, and it has two parameters that you can access: error and info, basically. So how does this work? So this is just my regular class, and I'm rendering something. And if the state has an error, I'm returning something went wrong, basically. What I can do now here is I can component did catch, and if something actually happens, I can do a display fallback UI. So I can say, hey, something went wrong. So I can tell the user, this shouldn't be here. There's still code there. It's still functional. And then I can technically log the error to my reporting service as well. So if you use like a rollbar or a sentry, for example, you can just kind of like log it in there and be like, hey, had an uncaught error. Boom. Developers happy because they see it, and users happy. They maybe call and be like, hey, you guys have a website issue. Like maybe you should check this out. But at least the whole application doesn't crash, and they can move on in their browsing behavior. And so the catch block for the components, and we have a sandbox for this as well. Let's see if this works. Oh, let's see. Oh no. There we go. So what does this mean? So this is basically built to error out whenever it hits number 5. So I'm over here, 1, 2, 3, 4, and now 5. Boom, something went wrong. I can show the details. I can say error, I crashed, and then I can basically see the error messages getting created by React. But over here, I can still click. This is still fully functional basically. So I can still move on with my application. This is still working fully. So as you can see, this part was unmounted. This part is showing me an alternative fallback UI basically. And then this is still working as regular in the application. So now it's going to be the tricky part. Let's see. Gotta go back. Ha. Alright, cool. So let's move on. So the error component is the recommended way to implement this. So what does this mean? So basically you can just build imagine like a utility component that's like an error boundary component. So whenever you have an error, whenever you have an error, in this scenario you don't have to rewrite the code and have like repetitive code in your code base, because you're probably always going to do the same. So just write a component for it and pass it through and use it. Oops. Plus. All right. So what does this mean? So I created a class called error boundary, which has the lifecycle method component did catch basically, and then now in here I'm returning just my card style, and if something went wrong, I'm just showing sorry something went wrong. So this could be a generic error handling component basically that you can reuse throughout your application basically. So now you don't have to rewrite this in every component you have. You just do it once, and then you implement that component and call this component whenever something goes wrong. And how you do this is basically over here in this example. So you have your render, which is returning your product list, which executes a method, render products basically, and render products up here. So it returns list.data products, and then it maps over it and shows all the products basically. And then you wrap the product element, which is the actual product, let's say like a list element for example, you wrap that into your error boundary. So now if this component here produces an error, it's going to be wrapped in the error boundary, it's going to show an error message basically. So now that's how you do it in safe code. You just wrap all the components basically that could create an error, and you want to catch the errors. You can wrap those in your error boundary, and boom, you save your work, and you don't have to like write the same code over and over and over again. Let's assume you have the same error handling in those different application types basically. All right, so now how does catch error looks in product? So this is how it looks like. This is what the product causes. So basically, what was I going to? Let's see. Oh yeah. So for example, and this happens to me all the time. Not all the time, but sometimes. You got the props, got the product, got the image URL, and there's always this one case where all of a sudden your name doesn't exist, and you have a function that says to uppercase, and then all of a sudden your whole app breaks, and that's kind of like where it comes in really needy. If you pass an information that you want to render, and you have a function on top of it, let's say name to uppercase, and you don't want to have like an if condition first, and want to check if the name is there, then do uppercase, and then pass it into a variable, and then use that variable in the JSX code. Now you can just literally write it, and if something happens, you got your error boundaries around it, it will be caught, and then you're good to go basically. So you could show something, hey, you're missing your first name, for example. So this is how easy it is, this is how cool it is, and I think this is one of the most unhandled errors, I would say, in React code. If you try to do something in a prop set and all of a sudden it doesn't exist, because especially in test data, you don't always create the best test data. And that's pretty much error boundaries. Any questions before we move on to portals? All right, cool. Portals. Not every website uses React. You're probably familiar with it. It's crazy. I know it sounds crazy because everybody does React right now. But there are parts that can be React right now. So think about like a CMS application like WordPress. It's a PHP framework. You're not going to all of a sudden rewrite this in React, right? Drupal, whatever it is. Those are just examples. We have just a regular page that's built in jQuery still, and you want to partially replace those parts by React basically. So now you can actually do that, and you can open new windows from your React application, access the information in that new window and that new React DOM element, and you can even pass through state, so it even shares the state basically. So Portal lets you render a bit of a React control DOM outside of the parent component. So what does that mean? Normally you have in the very root file, you have React DOM, enter, hang on, it's called. You have your DOM basically that you define what you want to render. You grab your object, let's say app, and then that goes into the app.js file. This is kind of like your very root parent. So what if you have like another object that's not part of this root? Well, you can't really access it. So with portals you can. So outside of the render, what does this mean? So if I have this class over here again, step one is we're creating a container, which over here is container element. We create an element called div. Now step two, we're rendering this. Step two, we create a portal with this subprops.children and the container element that we defined over here. So now we got this subprops.children, which lets us access this data and pass through this data. And then we define the create element div over here and pass that through. So now when my component div mount, I create a new window. So I just open a window basically. That's a separate window from my React application. Just say, you know, width, height, whatever, works fine, opens up a new window. So now I can access this external window like a function basically, and I can say document body append children this container elements. So now I can access the information that are in my other parent component basically, and I can access the information And then I can basically close the window if I unmount it basically. So now it's closing the portal again, I'm good to go. But I can now access the information in the other window, which normally is another parent. And now I can kind of like work in between. How this works, I have a little sandbox for this as well. Oops. There we go. So how does this work? So I have my counter, which is in my state. I open my portal, which is a new window. I have two different parents, and you can see the state is shared. In both windows, the state is counting up basically. So now I can just close it again, and the text changed here as well, but basically if I can click open again, it's still sharing the state basically. So now I have two different parents, I can access them vice versa, and I can access the information from one parent to another parent. I personally haven't used it yet, but I figured it was worth mentioning if you guys ever had that use case. Let me go back. Alright, cool. Next. Alright, that's portals. But this is old stuff. This was a couple months ago. Just kidding. No, but this is basically, this has been introduced a little bit ago. Context API was, I think, 16.3. We're at 16.6 right now. Error boundaries came with 16.0, got improved throughout the stuff and so on. Memo, lazy, and context type. This is, guys, this is hot stuff. This just got released yesterday. But this is really cool, and I was really excited it was today, and they announced it yesterday, so I was like, cool. I'm going to be the first one talking about this. So I'm going to be unique, because everybody talks about React, but hey, I'm going to be the first one talking about these new features, which is awesome. What is this? So basically, it is very similar to React Pure Component, which has been introduced in the past. And now it's for classes. So before it was just for components, now you can do it on the whole class. And again, remind me, what does this mean? What does it do for a component? So basically, it's a performance booster. If the function component renders the same result, it will skip rendering. So as you know, whenever you change the state or you change values, it re-renders everything that's behind that tree, basically. Well, sometimes you're re-rendering over and over the same information, and it slows down your app, basically. So now, they have pure components. If you define pure components, if the result in the render is the same, it wouldn't re-render it basically. So it compares what would it render. If it's the same, then okay, I'm fine. I don't need to re-render my application. And the same thing I can do with classes now as well, and not just components. And I can literally just wrap my class into a React memo, and that will basically store the previous state, you could say almost. And then it will compare that whenever you re-render it and make changes. And this is only a shallow comparison, so this is pretty shallow. But here's the cool thing, you can control the comparison. So you can actually dive into the data and compare data now and see if this data is different in particular, then re-render. If not, then you're fine. I only care about this particular data set right now. So how does this look like? It's pretty easy. All I have to do is get the right screen size. Here we go. When I export my class, all I do is export default React. I think there's a spelling mistake. Meaning basically. And then I have my component and are equal. Those are my two available functions in here. And so now I can technically access this. So are equal is my previous props and my next props available. And this is now where I can jump in and make some comparisons within the data and see if something got changed. And also the important is it only returns, it returns true if it's passing the next props to render, would return the same results as passing previous props to render, otherwise it will return false. So this really just returns true or false, this whole function basically, so keep that in mind if you do evaluations and your conditional stuff. This only returns true or false, and then you can basically say re-render or don't re-render. So be careful. I remember people that did it on pure components, they all of a sudden they did a search and refine in their projects, and they did like pure component everywhere, and then all of a sudden you make changes and nothing re-renders. You're like, what is going on? And so basically be careful when you use this. This is cool to boost your performance, especially if you have a lot going on, but be careful because there are going to be use cases where you're going to be thankful for that re-rendering of that class basically. So make sure you test that appropriately. All right, Mr. Lazy over here. And that was my favorite change that just came out. Favorite lazy is code splitting with suspense. Code splitting was normally done in Webpack and it was a kind of a painful setup, but now it's built into React and it was done with Webpack as I just said, and now it's fully built in and it's actually really easy to use. So before, this was your easy component. Let me make this bigger. Simple component, right? Import other component, and then you have my component, and then you return. In that my component, you return other component basically, right? Render it. It would then render when this is rendered, and then you're done. Okay, so pretty simple stuff. Now let's look at how it looks like afterwards. Now I'm importing my component differently. So instead of just importing it, I say React lazy, and then I return it in a function. I say in the function I import my other component basically. So by wrapping this into React lazy, that's all it is. I did my code splitting for this component basically. So what does this mean exactly? This will automatically load the bundle containing the other component when this component gets rendered. So what does that mean? So basically whenever this one component is ready, it will be displayed. And this makes a lot of sense when you have multiple components. And you have to be also careful in the case that the component renders first. So imagine you have a really big component and then there's like a little tiny component in that. So that one, sorry, other way around. If you have your component and you have that component within that component, so you basically, hang on, let me explain it back. Let me go up here.
I don't understand.
Okay, Siri, that's okay. I understand. So let's see. So let's say my component renders before my other component. Normally other component should render first because it's normally smaller, it gets smaller and smaller. But let's just imagine my component already rendered fully, other component is still loading and still rendering. So you have to have a fallback method and a fallback URL for that. And that's where the fallback component comes in. I missed one. This, there we go. And this is where suspense comes in. So instead of just having the other component, which is imported via React lazy, now you just wrap that into a suspense fallback, and you can provide a div that just has loading, for example. So now once it's rendered fully, this loading will be replaced by the other component. And you can obviously, this can be any component. So you can have like a loading component that has like a loading animation, like an SVG or something in there. And so imagine you have multiple blocks like 6 different blocks. That could be like 6 different graphs, for example. Whenever one graph is ready, they're going to be displayed, and the rest will have like a loading spinner, for example. So this is really hot stuff. So yeah, the fallback props accept any React element, so you don't have to just pass in like a div. You can pass in a P, another component, whatever you want to do basically. Whatever is a React element, you can pass through. And you can wrap multiple components as well. So this is really easy too. So same thing, I'm just importing via React lazy, other component, another component. And then I got my section over here, and it's still wrapped in my suspense. And boom, now they both have to be ready in order before I can do this, otherwise it's going to be the fallback basically. So I can wrap multiple ones as well, not a problem. I can have different suspenses and different handlings for that as well if I wanted to. And then error boundaries in combination with lazy loading exist as well. So we just talked about error boundaries and how that all works. And then we can do the same thing with lazy loading as well. In case there would be like an error, for example. So this is where, I think I did this. Did I skip one? Oh, okay. This is the React router. Maybe I messed up on this one, sorry. This is the React router. So you can even wrap your suspense within your router where you have your switch method basically. Sorry, I think this is the wrong screen. I'm going to fix this basically before I distribute the slides. This is the React router part. So you can even use it in your React router. So if you have your React router, you can import your components from your path basically, and you can put a suspense fallback behind it as well. So now you can load all the different routes behind it as well. Same thing, code splitting on the React router level, basically. Wonder if the other one comes up. No, I messed up the picture. Sorry guys, there was another picture right here. So I'm gonna correct that before I send it out. There was basically a picture that combines error boundaries with the lazy loading basically and the suspense. So I'm gonna fix that. And then just one warning, if you guys use server-side rendering, it's not supported yet, so this is only for client-side rendering so far. I'm sure in the next couple of versions they're gonna release it for server-side rendering as well. Context type. All right, so we talked about context API. Let's talk about context type. It's basically an addition to the context API, and it's a convenience API for classes. So what does that mean? We talked about context API, but we probably didn't realize it right away, but we only used the consumers in components. We didn't use it in classes necessarily. So there was a way to make a class consumer, but it was kind of like difficult. So now they built a convenience API for that for classes. So now even a class can be a consumer. And how that looks like is pretty much like this. So I can just define my context type over here, which is my context, and then I can literally access this .context wherever I want to in whatever lifecycle. And I can access now, I can be a consumer as a class basically. That wasn't something that wasn't possible before. And so it was possible, it wasn't as convenient as it is right now with this new API that they created. So now I can just access the context within my class. So if I basically create a context in my class, I can now also be a consumer and consume these information in my context. And again, this only works right now V1, so this works only with a single context right now. So you can't have multiple contexts in one class. And that's pretty much it. I hope I wasn't too bad on time. That's pretty much it. Just a couple of comments. So it looks like a lot of changes are coming with React. I know it's always something where you're like, whoa, like what's going on? There's so many changes. So don't worry. There's a quote by Vasvas, you might know him. I quoted him last time as well because I really like the quote. It's basically, React is evolving, but most of these are additions and not changes to make your application better, basically. So just because you don't use it right away doesn't mean your app will break. If you upgrade and don't use it, your app most of the time won't break either, at least not the smaller ones. But really those things we just talked about, context API, error boundaries, those are things you probably struggled with before because like your app crashed or you had props drilling. So now you can refactor some of the code and kind of use that to make your life a little bit easier and make the code more readable and more stable basically. So that's a good thing. So if you guys want more, all the changes are on the React.js blog as well. They have a great blog with all the stuff. They just released the 16.6, which was yesterday, the blog. I put a link in there, so if you want to read the full blog of what they all changed. Those were kind of like the major changes. They had some bug fixes and everything in between there as well. And I hope this was useful, and feel free to ask any questions if you have questions. That's it. Thank you. So I'll fix that one screenshot and then I'm going to put the sys-base, just a GitHub repo on a page, and then you can just access that. We'll get the video probably next week, and then
yeah, and if you do have questions, go ahead and ask them now, because like we'll do the contest too, like in the section.
We don't compete. We're married.
easy contest.
She's been working 7 months on hers, so she has to win.
All right. Yeah, like before we do anything, like, is there any questions? Because I always want you guys to ask like whatever burning question you have. That's really kind of point of the meetup. Even if you don't know what React is, that's actually really interesting. I mean, that's fine.
Yeah.
You should ask anything you want.
Any questions? Doesn't have to be necessary to this. If you have other React questions, yeah, sure.
Weren't you gonna mention some changes in the Create React app?
I did it last time.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so last time I talked about, because they just updated that as well, they updated to Create React at version 2. And so they added some really cool features there. I mean, they upgraded like Jest and Webpack 4. One of my favorite features and additions is, and I believe everybody's, is they now support CSS modules basically. So before you couldn't use CSS modules unless you eject basically the app, and now you can configure everything. And I was a big fan of CSS modules, so now it's by default built into Create React App. And you can now use CSS modules by default. There are a couple other changes. I'm not talking about that, like Jest upgraded, Webpack upgraded, CSS modules. I mentioned them all in the other presentation. So if you get the link, I linked it here, so you get the other link, and then you can read it up all in there. I mentioned all the different changes there. Kind of went through that as well. Oh, and then SVGs you can use. If you import SVGs, you can use them as React components now. So you don't have to use an image tag anymore. You can just use like you have to. Like, yeah, the point gets clear. Yes.
Would a portal be an alternative for an iframe?
That's a good question. It depends, because in an iframe you might want to show something completely different. So if you have like a slash animation in your portal, it's going to be different. But if you have just different HTML elements, yes, you could technically open up that application within your portal, and then you can actually access information from your React app in that application basically. So now you can access the information in your portal that you create. Yes. Iframe is normally built within, so like no, but like it's pretty much, it gets close to it. Yes, you can technically do it. Yes. But like one thing personally, I wouldn't like, because I'm not a big portal fan. It's because if I open a new window, I have a pop-up. I'm not a big fan of pop-ups, so that's why I probably haven't used it yet that much. And I always work on like full React projects. But again, if you have like a WordPress, for example, where you have like one component that's just to React, and then you're trying to access that data in another WordPress component, for example, then you could do that, for example.
It'd be really good for like if you have a game lobby and then you want to pop up like a chess game for
Yeah.
some people.
You could
be sharing that.
Yes, you could do that. Yeah, you can. So you can pass like user information, for example. You can do all that stuff. Yes. Definitely. Right.